Welcome to another episode of the Environment in Canada podcast, a podcast about the environment in Canada by Sierra Club Canada. I'm Connor Curtis, Head of Communications with Sierra Club Canada, and today I'm going to be chatting with you about why oil and gas companies don't care about you, but they love taking your money, and about why we should cap their emissions. Before we begin, just a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca. We have tons of petitions, other actions and events, and regular news updates you can sign up for on the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on the Harbinger Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, and on CHMA Radio in Sackville, New Brunswick on Saturdays at 11 a.m. Atlantic Daylight Time. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe so you get the latest episodes from us. Today's podcast is going to be a little different than our normal content on the show. As this airs on September 24th, 2024, Sierra Club Canada is hosting a special exhibit in New York City during New York Climate Week. The aim of this exhibit, entitled Protect What We Love, is to showcase artifacts recovered from wildfires, floods, and severe storms in Canada. These climate relics are accompanied by some of the climate survivors from whose homes and businesses they were recovered. These people from British Columbia, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and Newfoundland and Labrador include Megan Fandrick, a trauma-informed editor, parent, and climate disaster survivor who lost their town of Lytton, BC to wildfire. And people like Mark Lamond, a resident of Codroy Valley, Newfoundland and Labrador, not far from where I grew up. When Hurricane Fiona hit his hometown of Port aux Basques, NL, it destroyed Mark's fishing stage and 5 homes of his family members. Other survivors include Heather McKay, a hairstylist, mother and grandmother who lost her home in a wildfire in summer 2023 in Kelowna. Diana Boston, a member of the Upper Nicola Band, her home was severely damaged in the 2021 flood in Merritt, British Columbia. Lorna Fandrick is a businesswoman and executive director of the Lytton Chinese History Museum, which is being rebuilt after it was destroyed by a wildfire in 2021. Then there's Cindy Dewick, a stay-at-home mom who lives in Abbotsford, British Columbia with her husband and 4 children. Her home and property were damaged by a historic flood in November 2021. And there's Raisa Marks, a small business owner and mother of 2 living in Montreal. Raisa took costly measures to protect their Montreal home from flooding and yet was still impacted by the flooding in Montreal in August of this year. Flooding, which, as the Montreal Gazette reported, cost $2.5 billion in insured losses. I'm going to play some audio now of one of their testimonies that captures the sort of stories you'll hear about at this exhibit.
On June 30th, 2021, my entire town burned to the ground. I ran from the flames. I lost my coffee shop, but more importantly, I lost my community and the town I grew up in, the town that I was raising my daughter in. When the fire hit, when my employees and I locked the door and ran, I definitely did not think that that would be it. Climate change is happening. It's affecting us right now. It's affecting our children right now. And we need policies in place that will hold the big polluters accountable.
These disasters are ever more frequent and ever more severe because of climate change. Climate change is directly caused by our reliance on oil and gas, and I, like you, am dependent on oil and gas to some extent. Looking through the artifacts and the stories of these survivors, as I had plenty of time to do this week, was heartbreaking, and it hit home. Yes, it's clear that we're all dependent on oil and gas to some degree, but it's also clear we need to get off this stuff. That's a moral dilemma, and it raises the question of where to start. I'm not going to claim to provide all the answers here, but I do want to talk about a few facts on why things have gotten as bad as they have that help provide context and bring forward one solution as well, an emissions cap on oil and gas corporations. I work in communications for the environmental movement. Another word for my job is public relations, or PR. It's honestly not where I ever thought I would end up, working as an environmental PR person. But I kept seeing what was happening with climate change, and I kept having opportunities to work in this space, and since it seemed to help, I kept doing it. Most issues, social, environmental, or otherwise, are a shade of grey. One of the reasons I was drawn to climate work was the issue's pretty mathematically right or wrong. There are emissions, their impact has an effect, one we're seeing in terms of homes lost, in terms of businesses lost, in terms of lives lost. That effect is caused by oil and gas, but dependency on oil and gas is really driven mostly by misinformation. It's one of the few issues in life where there truly is a clear divide in that respect. What keeps me awake at night is my counterparts, the PR people who work for the oil and gas corporations selling the product that causes climate change. It's partially because, of course, my job is often responding to things they have said, but it's also partially because they're honestly kind of perplexing. You see, it's one thing to use a product, but public relations in the corporate world is supposed to do something beyond just let a product get sold because someone needs it. Public relations is supposed to sell the idea that the company behind the product is a force for good, that their actions are good for you and me, and that as a result we should keep buying their product on a greater and greater scale. In my case, public relations work means selling climate action, and my goal at least is to sell it to such a point that I am no longer needed. As my grandfather who managed food co-ops would say, the best manager puts themselves out of a job. And that's very much how I see climate communications, as ultimately something that will put me out of the job if successful. At which point I hope to retreat into the woods, do something generally good for people for money, and let the world pass by. I want to be clear in what I say next here that I'm talking directly about lobbyists and comms people working for the oil and gas corporations. I'm not talking about the workers getting oil and gas out of the ground and shipping it. Those people who rely upon oil and gas to put food on the table and might not have access to other jobs in their area at this time. But for oil and gas PR people, those public relations people, the need to sell a product that will ultimately unhouse and kill millions of people is really disturbing. In fact, since millions of people already die every year around the world due to fossil fuel-caused ambient air pollution, they've already got a considerable death toll going. There's even an equation for the value public relations brings to a corporation beyond just a corporation selling their product. And this matters because it's one thing to be dependent on something, one thing to buy it and sell it at a fair price and to meet a market demand, and another thing entirely to sell or enforce dependency on a bad product when a better one exists. It's one thing to say we need oil and gas for a while we transition. It's another thing to say we should stay dependent on that thing and we should do nothing to regulate it. It's a totally different thing past that to claim that we should expand it at the taxpayer's expense, even while we know we have the reserves necessary with existing oil and gas projects to see ourselves through a green transition to renewables. But that's exactly what oil and gas public relations people do. Enforce, convince, sell, and otherwise keep us hooked on oil and gas as a product. And yet, I imagine most of the people listening to this don't know even one of their names. That's because in the corporate PR world, unlike in the climate and NGO PR world, there's a culture of no matter what, that the PR person doesn't get called out. And that isn't to defend absolutely everything that's ever been said in favor of the environment, but if there's one thing you can count on, it's that environmentalists love criticizing each other, maybe even too much sometimes, but it does have the general impact of keeping some of us accountable. Worse, across the whole corporate PR world, there's generally a culture of not calling each other out when something is wrong. And that's what keeps me awake at night. What are they thinking about? And how do they justify what they are doing? Do they really believe in oil and gas, or do they see the science and just decide, meh, it's bringing me home a lot of money to pitch delays on climate action, so I'll advocate to delay climate action? Or maybe they do just enjoy the thrill of the challenge of convincing people of something, and that something for them is that oil and gas is worth continuing our dependency on. Challenging my own beliefs is important, and so I've tried many times to sympathize with the oil and gas public relations person. Maybe they were raised in a family that's so pro-industry they really believe the garbage climate denial stuff, or maybe they really think their product is needed for energy security or to alleviate energy poverty. Neither of those things are true, but maybe they genuinely think that they are. Maybe for them, we're evil environmentalists holding everyone back, and we're just hypocrites. The turning point for me, though, is the emissions cap issue. For those not aware of what the cap is, I encourage you to check out our previous episode on it. Simply put, it's a regulation that would hold oil and gas corporations in Canada to the bare minimum in emissions reductions. The emissions reductions they themselves claimed were technically feasible, and promised in all those ads where they said they were cleaning up their act. For the most part, this means reducing methane emissions, which is relatively cheap to achieve for these companies. Yet already the oil and gas PR people are out there advocating against the emissions cap, against the promises their own corporations made. For me, that's the line, not even advocating your company commit to the bare minimum. And once you cross that line, there's no claiming that you weren't aware of the consequences. There's no claiming you acted because you thought oil and gas was a force for good in the world. I've tried never to judge anyone for relying on oil and gas because we all do. I don't feel any judgment towards those who work to extract, refine, and transport oil and gas because that's what puts food on the table for them. If an oil and gas company comes out tomorrow with a plan to go 100% renewable as rapidly as they can and to devote a huge percentage of their expenditures to renewable energy, I'd celebrate that. But I do judge the PR person who wants their company to operate at a level of double standard where even the bare minimum emissions reductions aren't enforced. When you say the corporation you represent should not even be accountable to its own claims, that's a special low to sink to. For me, that's even worse than being an oil and gas CEO, at the top of the organization and making all the decisions. Because when it comes to fighting against even the basic principle that a corporation should be beholden to its own promises, the PR people at oil and gas corporations are inevitably the people who egg the CEO on, who enable them to be worse than they were beforehand. The PR people are the ones who say, look, if you want, we can defeat the emissions cap and you can keep a tiny bit more profit as a result. Maybe some of those CEOs might be more reasonable if they weren't also being sold on a train of thought that they can just keep going with no consequences. And one of the first things you learn if you study public relations is that part of your job is to advise the people around you on what they should do. That's something for a PR person in the oil and gas industry to think about. And that is what we are talking about with the emissions cap, a policy that we are calling for as part of this exhibit in New York City. A really easy to implement measure these oil and gas corporations can do. It's a policy that no matter what you think of me or my views or an environmental climate cause is fundamentally fair for all of us. Because individually, Canadians have brought down their emissions. Oil and gas corporations, by contrast, are around 30% of Canada's national emissions, despite being just 5% of our national economy. Make no mistake, Canada has very high per capita emissions relative to other countries, and we also have historical emissions. We've been emitting for a much longer time than other countries. We can't ask other people with much lower per capita emissions, that's emissions per person, by the way, to act on climate change if we don't act to regulate these companies in Canada. Because our country's failure to meet emissions targets is really not individuals' fault in Canada. This is a failure that is the fault of large oil and gas corporations which have failed to act. And these are wealthy corporations. As Environmental Defense points out, Canada's 5 biggest oil and gas companies had $38.3 billion in combined profits in 2022. More to the point, of every dollar of inflation over the 2 years preceding 2023 in Canada, 25 cents of that has gone to oil and gas and mining extraction profits, according to the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. So yes, these companies can afford to do the bare minimum. Basic measures they are not doing otherwise, without regulation. Anyone who has ever lit a campfire will know that the conditions into which a spark enters matter. If it's dry and hot, then fires start more easily, and they burn faster and hotter. The rise in extreme wildfires across North America is linked directly to emissions from oil and gas corporations. A peer-reviewed study released in 2023 found that 37% of the total burned forest area in Western Canada and the United States between 1986 and 2021 can be traced back to 88 major fossil fuel producers and cement manufacturers. 13 Canadian oil and gas companies, including 5 of the 6 that make up the Pathways Alliance oil sands lobby group, are on this list of 88 big carbon polluters. From 1990 to 2022, GHG emissions from conventional oil production have increased by 24%, while emissions from oil sands production have increased by 467%. There's also evidence to suggest that Canada is underestimating oil sands emissions by up to 6,000%. The direct connection between these emissions and climate change is stark. Climate change made British Columbia's deadly summer 2021 heatwave 150 times more likely. The 2023 record-breaking wildfires in eastern Canada were at least twice as likely due to climate change, and fossil fuel-driven climate change made the fire-prone weather about 20 to 50% more intense. Climate change made high temperatures at least twice as likely before the 2024 Jasper wildfire. And in turn, those wildfires are creating a feedback loop of emissions. Canada's record-breaking 2023 wildfires emitted more carbon pollution than the burning of fossil fuels in all but 3 countries. For the record, Canada's forests haven't absorbed more carbon than they've released since 2001. Meanwhile, in terms of severe storms, Hurricane Fiona was among the 10 most expensive climate disasters worldwide. We can't adapt to these impacts on a scale big enough to nullify them. We can only hope to mitigate emissions now enough to prevent worse impacts in the future. Case in point, the situation of heat is so bad now that even adaptive measures like controlled burns are themselves often made impossible by the risk of starting a wildfire. Something we covered in an earlier podcast about the Jasper wildfire, where we also talked about the connection between the pine beetle and climate change.
And just to be clear here, the pine beetle wasn't the major factor in the Jasper wildfire. Temperatures were 7.1 to 10.3 C higher across Jasper than averages recorded between 1991 and 2020 on the day that the fire started. But pine beetle numbers are themselves driven by warmer conditions. I think it's worth mentioning here too that in the case of Valemount, British Columbia, there were also increases to gas station prices as evacuees flooded the town. And that's really concerning because it shows a real lack of empathy on the part of the companies that own those gas stations, these same oil and gas corporations that make these huge profits. Local management, I will say as a caveat there, had no say in those gas price increases. But it's a very low bar to reach when you're taking advantage of a situation of evacuees fleeing Jasper to raise prices and try to make the most out of that situation as a corporation.
And while we are on the subject of oil and gas industry PR people, let's have a look at their record here, because they have played a direct role in making this situation worse. As The Guardian has reported, to paraphrase, previous releases of internal documents have shown that the oil industry knew of the devastating impact of climate change, but chose instead to downplay and even deny these findings publicly in order to maintain their business model. Criticism has intensified after Big Oil admitted to gaslighting the public over green aims and wished bedbugs on critical activists. That's a threat that, compared to some of the ones I've seen online against climate activists, seems kind of funny more than anything else. Indeed, to quote The Guardian again, the oil giant Exxon privately predicted global warming correctly and skillfully, only to then spend decades publicly rubbishing such science in order to protect its core business. And the people who rubbished that science were public relations people. They're the ones who played probably the most major role in making sure we all delayed climate action, and in setting in motion some of the impacts that we're seeing now. Because the truth is that without their efforts, we would be much further on the road to a transition to renewable energy and to green solutions. And this shameful stalling of climate action didn't stop with climate denial in the past. Now we're seeing a whole new type of climate denial that's focused just on delaying action or saying we can't act. Indeed, thanks to reporting by the Narwhal, reporting so explosive even the National Post had to cover it, we know that in Canada, an oil and gas executive told attendees at a TC Energy Lunch and Learn session that we've been given opportunities to write entire briefing notes for ministers and premiers and prime ministers, and that he claimed the company's efforts dramatically influenced BC's carbon tax rate adjustment in February 2023 and ultimately halved the operation costs of the province's carbon tax on the company's projects. All this happened while people like you and me were doing our part for climate action. And what it demonstrates is that the PR people working for oil and gas corporations have not changed course. We also know that, thanks to reporting from the National Observer, there has been a backroom campaign to try and sink the federal emissions cap by the oil and gas industry that's been going on for quite some time now. So let's go over some critical emissions cap facts for the record. The emissions cap is not a carbon tax. Without an effective emissions cap on oil and gas corporations, other sectors and Canadians would need to carry the weight of reducing their emissions to offset the emissions of oil and gas corporations. An emissions cap is about fairness. It's about making oil and gas corporations do the same work the rest of us are doing to cut our emissions. The cap is more than fair. As stated, oil and gas corporations, while only 5% of Canada's economy, are around 30% of our national emissions. This is a cap on wealthy corporations. It's not a cap on individual people. The cap does not make inflation worse, but oil and gas corporate profits are. We get into that in a previous podcast episode on the cap, linked below, but again, it's worth remembering a huge amount of what you paid for in inflation went to oil and gas and mining profits. Not workers, not the bottom line, but profits at the top of these corporations. The emissions cap is not a production cap and will not harm the economy or jobs. It really is just a bare minimum. The oil and gas corporations who now claim foul over the emissions cap said previously they could meet the emissions targets in this cap, and this cap holds them to that promise. The recent claims of oil and gas funded studies which used rigged assumptions do not change this fact under any realistic scenario. Oil and gas corporations have accepted mass sums of taxpayer money for carbon capture and storage based on a claim those same corporations made that they could reduce emissions. The emissions cap is not controversial. 2 independent polls found a majority of Albertans support a cap on emissions. 7 out of 10 Canadians also support a cap. 89% of Canadians also back tougher methane regulations according to surveying. And that's important because, again, a large part of the lifting done by this cap is done by these companies addressing methane emissions, which is relatively cheap to do. Canada needs an emissions cap. The Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development of the Office of the Auditor General of Canada, that's a mouthful, has concluded that the federal government is set to miss its 2030 target to cut carbon emissions, and that the emissions cap needs to be implemented soon. The International Energy Agency, meanwhile, is calling for a 60% reduction in oil and gas emissions by 2030 to avoid the worst climate catastrophes. Oil and gas corporations were consulted on a cap. In February of 2023 alone, oil and gas corporation lobbyists met with federal government officials at least 91 times. Liquefied natural gas, or LNG, should not be given a special exemption or treatment underneath the emissions cap. Producing and transporting LNG releases methane, even a small amount of which can make it as bad a greenhouse gas emitter as coal or worse. There's no evidence that LNG exports would significantly reduce coal exports elsewhere, and so there's really no reason LNG should be exempt from an emissions cap. It should be covered. And here's the thing, an emissions cap can save lives. This year, tens of thousands of Canadians were forced to evacuate because of wildfires, and Indigenous communities were particularly affected. But there are benefits to an emissions cap that happen before even talking about climate change, that happen because of reductions in ambient air pollution. A fair cap on emissions from oil and gas at the same level as Canada's national climate target, 45% below 2005 levels by 2030, would avoid the premature deaths of approximately 4,860 people in Canada over a decade and come with an economic benefit of $45.1 billion, according to an analysis from the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment. This is before considering the climate change and non-fatal impacts of the air pollution prevented by a strong cap. It's a measure supported by labour organisations as well. The president of the Canadian Labour Congress welcomed the announcement of the emissions cap framework, and Canada's Building Trade Union has also come out in favour of the proposed emissions cap. The impacts we are seeing are bad, and we need to brace for what is to come. But activism up until today has stopped emissions that would have already pushed us past tipping points. Every bit of pollution we can stop helps stop damage from getting worse. So while the cap isn't everything we as environmentalists might have hoped for, it is a policy built on something we all, environmentalists and non-environmentalists alike, should be able to agree upon: fairness. At the end of the day, corporations should do as much as individual Canadians are doing. And if oil and gas PR people can't get behind that, then I am truly sorry for them. Because that's the moment you pass from the realm of I should have known better and into the realm of I knew it was wrong. I knew it would kill people for a few cents of profit, and I did it anyway.
Case in point, after anti-greenwashing legislation was brought in Canada showing that corporations need to provide some evidence for their green claims, major oil and gas lobbyists in Canada pulled down large sections of their social media and websites.
If you're interested in learning more and finding out sources for today's episode, we are including links to those resources below. And if you're in New York City today, September 24th, 2024, be sure to drop by 148 East 40th Street in Manhattan to see the exhibit. You can alternatively take action for an emissions cap at sierraclub.ca. We'll include a link to our petition in the description too. Here's another testimony from a climate survivor to finish today's episode.
We always worry. When you live in Kelowna, it's not a if there's a fire, it's a when. We lost everything we own, minus a carry-on bag each. I miss my grandson's rocking chair that I used to rock him to sleep in. I miss the memories we made in that house. And I just feel like we've never really been home since. The oil gas industry needs to be held accountable. They need to have caps put on, and it needs to happen now.
Before we end today, just a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca. We have tons of petitions, other actions and events, and regular news updates you can sign up for on the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on the Harbinger Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM, bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. ET, and on CHMA Radio in Sackville, New Brunswick on Saturdays at 11 a.m. Atlantic Daylight Time. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe so you get the latest episodes from us.